Welcome back to Fine Tuning with Drew Taylor, your one-stop shop when it comes to animation news and commentary. I'm entertainment writer Jim Hill, and Mr. Taylor, whose writings on the industry you can regularly read over on the Wrap, and whose musings on the Mission Impossible movies you can listen to on Light the Fuse, the official Mission Impossible podcast. Well, Drew isn't here this week. He and his lovely bride, Katie, are somewhere on the East Coast right now. They're either wandering around in the concrete canyons of Manhattan or out driving somewhere in the Connecticut countryside. I believe Mr. Taylor said something prior to climbing on a plane out in L.A. this past Friday that he would be getting some FaceTime with his brand new niece. So wherever Drew is right now, I wish him well, and don't worry, he'll be back for the next edition of Fine Tuning, I think. And if not, well, Drew will definitely be back for the podcast after that. So not to sweat, okay? In the meantime, I will be holding down the fort here, and I am recording this week's show on Monday, September 30th, 2024, and we will get to the news of the week in a moment. And then in today's feature, we're gonna talk about a commemorative plaque that may or may not still be on display in the lobby of the Broadway Theater in New York City. Again, we'll get to that story in a moment. But first, the news. And as always, the news portion of Fine Tuning is brought to you by TouringPlans.com. If you're headed down to Central Florida anytime soon to sample some of the theme parks that can be found around the city beautiful, well, Touring Plans can help you save time. More importantly, it can help you save money as you wander around Walt Disney World and the Universal Orlando Resort. So please check them out at TouringPlans.com. Now to the news, and as Mr. Testa always likes to say over on the Disney Dish, every podcast should begin with a hearty round of self-congratulations, and I don't know if I actually shared this insight last week with fine-tuning listeners. I do know that when Eric Hersey, he's the producer of this podcast, by the way, not to mention my co-host over on the Epic Universal podcast. Anyway, I know that Eric and I talked about this on last week's Epic Universal podcast, and that was on that Wednesday or thereabouts. Universal shared with the entertainment press its internal projections for the opening weekend box office for The Wild Robot, which, of course, was and still is the new Chris Sanders film that DreamWorks Animation at that time was about to release to theaters. And at that time, Universal Pictures said that they expected The Wild Robot to sell at least 20 million worth of tickets in North America. Which I said at the time to Eric, that seemed low. I mean, the weekend previous, Transformers 1, that Josh Cooley movie that Paramount Pictures had just sent out into theaters, it had done 25 million domestically. And again, as I shared with Mr. Hersey at that time, The Wild Robot, given the great reviews that this DreamWorks animation film had already gotten, not to mention the terrific buzz that was already surrounding this new Chris Sanders film, I thought that this Universal Pictures release would at least earn as much as Transformers 1. But then I went further, saying something to the effect of, I think that Universal might deliberately be lowballing us here so that they can claim when The Wild Robot goes on to sell 35 million worth of tickets over its opening weekend in North American theaters that studio execs are now delighted by this surprising turn of events. Okay, so what does Wild Robot wind up doing domestically over its opening weekend? It sells 35 million worth of tickets in North America. I'm shocked, people, absolutely shocked. Not to mention an additional 18 million worth of tickets overseas for a worldwide box office total to date of 53 million. So that's a good start, especially for an animated feature released in September when all the kids are back in school. And speaking of DreamWorks, it's now been nearly a year and a half since The Bad Guys made its bow in theaters back in April of 2022 and then went on to sell 250 million worth of tickets worldwide, which was strong enough box office for the folks at Universal to say, this feels like a franchise. Which is why, in November of last year, we got that The Bad Guys, A Very Bad Holiday, Christmas special on Netflix. And earlier this year, again, 2024, we got official confirmation that a Bad Guys sequel will be arriving in theaters on August 1st, 2025. And this week, well, on Thursday, October 3rd to be exact, we get The Bad Guys Haunted Heist, which is a Halloween special where Mr. Wolf and company attempt to swipe a priceless amulet from a spooky mansion and then wind up battling a supernatural foe. One Reginald E. Scary. Just side note here, is that supposed to be a riff on Richard Scarry, the author, illustrator of all those Busy Town books? When Alice was growing up, I spent a lot of time reading her the tales of Huckle Cat and Lowly Worm. I honestly don't recall seeing Mr. Snake or Mr. Piranha in the background of all those busy books, but maybe I need to go back and take another look. And if you're marking things on your calendar, please note that Moana 2 will be arriving in theaters on November 27th. More to the point, if you really want to appreciate the size of that whale shark, which is featuring prominently in a lot of the advertising for this, directed by David Derrick Jr., Jason Hand, and Dana Ledoux Miller movie. You need to see this Walt Disney Animation Studios release in IMAX. And speaking of upcoming releases from Disney, the folks at IMAX also want to remind you that just 3.5 weeks after that, Mufasa, The Lion King, opens in theaters on December 20th. And as for that film, which is a sequel-prequel to Disney's photorealistic remake of The Lion King from 2019, I don't know if you folks have gotten to see that piece that Matthew Rudoy wrote for Screen Rant just this past weekend, but Matthew talks about how, based on all the criticism that the CG in that Lion King remake got, the Mufasa team opted to go a different way with this film, with the idea that all of the animals in Mufasa, the Lion King, wouldn't be totally photorealistic, but rather more expressive and cartoonish. So, gotta say, it's going to be interesting to see how this actually plays out. Also, just to be clear here, when I say sequel-prequel, what I mean is that, well, the framing device for Mufasa, the Lion King, is that we have Timon, Pumbaa, and Rafiki telling Simba's daughter, Kiara, about the grandfather she never met, Mufasa, and that's the wraparound for the bulk of this motion picture, which then talks about how Mufasa, as an orphan cub, comes to meet Scar and eventually rises to power, become the leader of a pride of lions in the African savannah. Let's see, what else? Oh yeah, we talked previously on this show about the Animation is Film Festival, which will be presented out in Hollywood at the TCL Chinese Theater from October 18th through the 20th. We've also talked repeatedly on the show how David Zaslav, the CEO of Warner Bros. Discovery, has been frustrating animation fans by taking completed motion pictures like Scoob, Holiday Haunt, and Coyote vs. Acme, and effectively deleting these projects for tax purposes. Well, one Warner-produced animated feature that somehow eluded Zaslav's asinine business plan is The Day the Earth Blew Up, a Looney Tunes movie. And the North American premiere of this Peter Braungart film will be held on Saturday, October 19th, again, at the Animation Film Festival. In fact, Peter himself is going to be on hand at the Chinese Theater to introduce this screening, which for my money is reason enough to attend this 3-day-long event. By the way, I'm assuming Drew, who will be moderating a number of panels at this year's Animation Film Festival, will be on hand for the screening, and then we'll report back in later about how it went. As you recall, Drew actually saw The Day the Earth Blew Up at Annecy last year, and from what he said, this Warner Brothers animation production got a really big reaction from the crowd lakeside. Oh, and I would also be remiss if I didn't acknowledge, as part of today's fine-tuning, that last night, and we're talking Sunday, September 29th, the series finale for The Simpsons aired on Fox. Okay. So it wasn't really the finale. It was actually episode 1 of season 35 of this now 37 times honored Academy Award-winning show. But the writers clearly had a lot of fun sending up all of the cliches associated with a long-running TV series coming to a close. And since I really don't want to spoil anything, I'm just going to say it was very nice to see Conan O'Brien back, and you should just go watch this show. Okay, let's see. That brings to an end this week's news segment. And in a moment, we're going to talk about how Shrek's Broadway debut back in 2008 wound up nudging Mickey Mouse out of the spotlight. But first, this. And we're back. Before we get started with the feature here, folks, on the first half of today's show, we mentioned Scoob Holiday Haunt, which was Warner Brothers Animation's follow-up to Scoob, which was originally supposed to be released to theaters, but due to the pandemic, wound up being shoved to the subscription streaming in May of 2020. Well, we may not be getting any new Scooby Doo stuff released theatrically these days, but that isn't preventing Warner Brothers Discovery from trying to cash in on this Hanna-Barbera character, which, by the way, first appeared as part of CBS's Saturday morning lineup on September 13th, 1965, some 55 years ago. And yes, I caught the first episode of Scooby Doo, Where Are You?, when it premiered in real time. I was 10 years old at the time and was already an enormous animation geek. Anyway, Warner Brothers Discovery, in an effort to cash in on Halloween, is launching Scoobtober, well, today. The day we're recording this episode of Fine Tuning, which again is Monday, September 30th, 2024. There will be marathons of Scooby-Doo episodes over on Cartoon Network, not to mention fan favorite films of the Scooby-Doo direct-to-video series, available for viewing on the WB YouTube channel, WB Kids YouTube channel, excuse me. And I'm just hoping that somewhere out there, I then get to see those episodes of the new Scooby Doo movies. This was that animated series' very first spin-off back in the fall of 1972 and featured the Mystery Inc. gang teaming up with celebrities like, well, Dick Van Dyke, Jonathan Winters, as well as screen comedy legends like Laurel and Hardy and the Three Stooges. Maybe some of those will be available for viewing over on MeTV Tunes, which is supposed to be the new home of Scooby-Doo. By the way, Scoobtober runs through the end of October, so if you want a break from Hocus Pocus over on Freeform's 31 Nights of Halloween, go check that out. Okay, so, as I mentioned at the top of today's show, Drew is away this week. He and Katie are somewhere to my south right now in New York and or Connecticut, enjoying some time with family. Prior to him flying out from LA, Mr. Taylor and I talked about me possibly driving down from New Hampshire for the day, so that he, me, Nancy, and Katie could do something fun in the city. There was a brief discussion of checking out Tim Burton's The Night Before Christmas Light Trail, which officially got underway at the New York Botanical Gardens this past weekend and is now running through November 30th. And to be honest, I was also hoping that at some point Drew and I might walk around New York and check out some animation-related sites, like, for example, the Broadway Theater, which is currently home to the musical stage version of The Great Gatsby. But back in 1928, which is kind of when Gatsby is set, this venue, which is located at the corner of Broadway and West 53rd, went by a different name. It was called the Colony Theater, and back then it was a movie house. And on November 18th of that year, if you bought a ticket and entered the Colony, you got to see live on stage MC Ben Burney, who had just completed a year-long engagement out in Los Angeles and was brought in at great expense to New York. You also got to see those singing sensations, the Four Nightingales, and the dancing team of Dugan and Parker. Mind you, these live performers were all a prelude to the Colony's cinematic presentation, and the feature was a startling drama. Not exciting, not entertaining, mind you, but startling. That's the word that the studio's PR team decided would be best to describe this movie. Startling. Anyway, that day's feature presentation was Gang War, which starred screen legend Mary Pickford's brother, Jack. Then there was that week's newsreel from Pathé. And then finally there was this thing that the theater was promoting as the first and only synchronized animated cartoon comedy, something called Steamboat Willie. Interesting bit on the story, the entertaining programming at the Colony Theater was continuous, which meant that it ran daily from 12 noon straight through to 11 p.m. So if you wanted, you could sit there all day and listen to Lillian Gordon. She was the featured headliner of the bill, a vocal soloist, every time she came out to perform. By the way, I spoke with Dave Smith about this back in the 1980s. Specifically, I was looking for how many times he thought that Steamboat Willie was presented daily during its world premiere engagement at New York's Colony Theater. And nearest Dave, who, I want to remind you, was the original archivist at Walt Disney Productions, nearest Dave could figure that synchronized sound cartoon played 5 times a day over its 2-week-long engagement. Okay, so doing the math here, that's 70 screenings in total for a Steamboat Willie for its 2-week-long engagement in New York City, which is honestly not a lot, especially in a dynamic city like Manhattan where there are so many other things to see and do. But Walt got lucky. That 2-week-long engagement in New York City was long enough for this Mickey Mouse cartoon to get reviewed by Variety, which noted that while Steamboat Willie was not the first animated cartoon to be synchronized with sound effects, it is the first to attract favorable attention. And then Film Daily went on to describe this Mickey Mouse cartoon as a real tidbit of diversion, which, to my way of thinking, is basically the same as saying your movie is startling. Mind you, this is kind of tepid praise for this Mickey Mouse cartoon, but it was enough. It was enough that Walt could secure additional bookings of Steamboat Willie, and the rest of that story you know. But the part of this story that you may not know is, well, back in 1978, when the company was mounting this elaborate celebration of Mickey Mouse's 50th birthday, that they sent legendary animator Ward Kimball on a whistle-stop tour across the country. Ward and Mickey, or somebody in the outfit, traveled by train from L.A. to New York, and they made stops at 57 different places along the way. And once Kimball and Disney's corporate symbol arrived at Grand Central Station, they were then whisked to the Broadway Theater. That's what the Colony got renamed in 1930 when the owners decided it was time to go legit, to stop screening movies inside of this 1,763-seat theater and begin only presenting live stage productions. By the way, that didn't last. I want to say in 1934, they went back to being a movie house, which is why Fantasia made its New York debut at this same theater. But after that, it went back to being a stage-only house. But anyway, back to Ward and Mickey. They arrive at the now Broadway Theater, where there, in a grand ceremony, Ward and Mickey unveil a plaque in the lobby that says some 50 years previously, this is where the world premiere of Steamboat Willie had been held. Okay, and so for the next 3 decades, this plaque is on display in the lobby of the Broadway Theater. I remember getting to see it in person in the fall of 1979 when I saw the original Broadway production of Evita, which, by the way, starred Patti LuPone, who you can watch right now in Agatha All Along over on Disney Plus, and at least I hope she makes it through this week's episode. She's walking the witch's road. Anyway, Evita opened at the Broadway Theater September 25th of 1979, and after winning 6 Tonys, runs in that same theater for nearly 5 years. Okay, we now jump ahead to December of 2008, which is when Shrek the Musical, after an out-of-town tryout at Seattle's Fifth Avenue Theater, opens at the Broadway Theater. Now, of course, Shrek the Musical is the stage adaptation of DreamWorks Animation's Academy Award-winning animated feature. More to the point, it is DreamWorks' first ever production for the stage, which is why Jeffery Katzenberg, the then head of DreamWorks Animation, is being very hands-on about Shrek the Musical. Jeffrey feels it's crucial for his company's future that this stage show be a success. Now, mind you, this isn't the first time that Katzenberg has been hands-on with a stage show. Back in 1993, when Disney was prepping its stage version of Beauty and the Beast, Jeffrey inserted himself into the creative process on that project as well. Folks who performed in the original Broadway cast of Beast talk about, well, how weird it was back when the stage musical was still trying out at the music hall in Houston. That even before the show's director, Robert Jesse Roth, was allowed to give the cast notes after each night's performance, Katzenberg would make his way backstage and then begin listing all of the changes that he felt needed to be made immediately to Beast. Anyway, all right, so Jeffrey, who, by the way, born in New York City back in December of 1950, and in fact, when he was 14, was a volunteer in John Lindsay's very successful mayoral campaign. So, again, Jeffrey, not a shy guy, never hesitant when it comes to speaking his mind, and is now back in the city with his second big Broadway show. But here's the thing. This is 2008, some 14 years after Katzenberg had been shown the door at Disney, and that dismissal still stings. How do I know this? Okay. So back in 2008, I am among the members of the press who got invited down to New York City to cover the opening of this new stage show. I remember talking with Christopher Seabird, who played Lord Farquaad in Shrek the Musical, about the challenges of playing a role where 8 times a week he basically had to sing and dance on his knees. Anyway, I am out in the lobby of the Broadway Theater waiting for my next interview. This is where the Shrek the Musical press team they're using this space as a holding area for this media event. And when I notice that, again, the 50th anniversary Mickey Mouse plaque that I had seen in this lobby back in 79 when I was there to see Evita, it's no longer on the wall in its usual spot of honor in that theater, which is when I turned to my press handler and said, "What happened to the plaque?" Which is when I got told an off-the-record story, which now, because it's nearly 16 years later since I got told this, I think I can now put this on the record. As the story goes, and again, let me stay here that I heard this story secondhand. I did not personally observe any of these proceedings, so they may or may not be true, but why let the truth stand in the way of a good story? All right, as it was explained to me, Jeffery Katzenberg arrives one day at the Broadway Theater prior to the start of the New York previews for Shrek the Musical. This would have been November of 2008. And it's at that time that Jeffrey reportedly notices the plaque in the lobby honoring Mickey Mouse. And Katzenberg supposedly tells the house manager at the Broadway Theater that plaque has to go. And the house manager then allegedly tells Jeffrey that, well, that's not how historical markers work, that you can't just pull them down because you don't like them. If the staff of the Broadway Theater were to take that thing down, they then may be in trouble with the city. There'd undoubtedly be bad press accompanying a move like that, which is why it might be better for all parties involved if that plaque stayed in the lobby right where it was. That said, it's still reportedly stuck in Jeffery Katzenberg's craw that there was this plaque in the lobby of the Broadway Theater honoring Mickey Mouse, who was the corporate symbol of the company that had very publicly let him go 14 years previously. So again, remember, this is Jeffrey, who, because working on the John Lindsay Mariel campaign, is very familiar with how things work in New York City. So he thinks about this a while, and then out ahead of the Broadway opening of Shrek, by the way, that happened on December 14th, that same year, 2008, Katzenberg comes up with just kind of an ingenious solution to his plaque problem. So Jeffrey goes to the house manager of the Broadway Theater and says, well, out ahead of the opening, I want this theater to shine. I want it to look amazing. And I got to say, I've been out in the lobby, and that plaque is looking kind of dingy. The bronze just isn't as shiny as it should be. That's why I think we need to send that thing out to be cleaned, maybe even restored, which obviously is different from being removed entirely, because something that's being cleaned and or restored will be returned eventually, right? So that's the story that I was told by my PR handler at Shrek the Musical, that the plaque that honored Mickey Mouse for the world premiere of Steamboat Willie at the Colony Theater back in 1928 was now out being cleaned, and that following a very thorough restoration of this bronze historical marker, it would then be returned to its place of honor in the lobby of the Broadway Theater. And I then asked the obvious question, which was, so how long do you guys expect that this restoration process is going to take? And my press handler paused for a moment, and their response was, it depends how long the Broadway production of Shrek runs. And just in case you're wondering, the stage production of this DreamWorks animation film ran for 12 months, closing on January 3rd, 2010. It then went out on tour in North America and had a very successful run on London's West End. And Shrek the Musical has since gone on to become enormously successful on the High School Musical, college, and community theater production circuit. It gets licensed all the time. But as for that plaque in the lobby of the Broadway Theater, to be honest, even though this venue has been home to highly successful revivals of Promises, Promises, Fiddler on the Roof, and Miss Saigon, not to mention new musicals for the stage like Sister Act in 2011, a stage adaptation of Rodgers and Hammerstein's TV musical Cinderella from 2013, and this year's production of The Great Gatsby, I have not been back in this place since I saw Shrek the Musical. Last time would have been October of 2009. Nancy and I actually got invited down to check out the show a second time. They had just added a brand new finale. They ended the show with the Monkees number, I'm a Believer. And at that time, I'm pretty sure that plaque was still out somewhere being cleaned. Well, I know because I checked. So I have to ask, and I'm hoping that one of our fine-tuning listeners out there has been to a show in the Broadway Theater over the past 15 years. And so do any of you know if that plaque has been returned to its place of honor in the lobby of the Broadway Theater, or is it still out there somewhere in Manhattan being very slowly and very thoroughly cleaned? Anyway, speaking of historical plaques, on next week's show, I will have a story about another historical plaque, one that I'm hoping will be installed soon near the site of the Fleischer Studios down in Florida, which is another animation-related story that starts in New York City. Let's see, beyond that, if you are missing Mr. Taylor as much as I am this week, I want to remind you that there is always Light the Fuse, the official Mission Impossible podcast, which Drew does with his equally talented co-host, Charles Hood. And also, we have a bunch of other podcasts here that we'd love you to give a listen to here at the Jim Hill Media Podcast Network. We, of course, have the Mothership. That's Disney Dish, which I do with Len Testa. Then there is, of course, the Epic Universal Podcast, which, again, I do with Eric Hersey, who, along with the very talented David Gray, produces a number of the shows here at JHM. We also have I Want That Too, which is our merch and history show that Lauren Hersey, that's Eric's lovely bride, and I do now on a weekly basis. Let's see, what else? There is also Looking at Lucasfilm, which Brian Gahn and I really need to get a new episode out on. Also, I want to remind you about the show that we host here on the Jim Hill Media Podcast Network, and that is Manufacturing the Magic. That is done by Shelley and Noah Valladolid, and it's a look back at the history of themed entertainment. And if that's the sort of stuff you enjoy, then you should definitely check out what our Patreon project, Disney Unpacked. I do that with Len and veteran Imagineer Jim Schul, and we are getting ready for our month-long celebration of the Equatorial Africa Pavilion that was proposed for Epcot and never got built. We've got a full suite of shows coming up about that, folks. In fact, I'm going to be recording a prelude show for that later this week. Let's see, what else? All right, beyond that, want to say that if you folks could do Drew and I a favor, if you could head over to Apple Podcasts and rate and review, well, not just the show you're listening to right now, Fine Tuning, but also Drew's wonderful official Mission Impossible podcast, Light the Fuse. That would be very helpful. Let's see, beyond that, I want to remind you that we do have a social media presence. You can find Drew by Googling Drew Tailored, like a tailor shirt. You can find me on Twitter and Instagram as Jim Hill Media, and over on Facebook as Jim Hill Media News. And again, that's going to do it for this week. So thank you so much for listening to Fine Tuning. And as I mentioned, Drew will be back next week, at the absolute latest the week after that. Till then, thanks for listening.